So I wanted to walk you through sort of how we think about technology and how it can help in these spaces. So I think historically, I want to start with the history of the web. So the web grew up on desktop. You had beefy machines, you were plugged into the power, so you didn't have to worry about battery life. You had a fast, always-on connection. And in that space, the web was really revolutionary because it helped users get and access businesses in a way that they couldn't do before, with much, much, much lower friction. You didn't have to drive to the store. You didn't even have to install any software. You just opened up your browser, you clicked the link, and you were there. And that low friction is pretty key. I think we forget about it today, but it's something that's still incredibly critical to a lot of businesses online. So then, flash forward to the first iPhone, and at the beginning, everyone thought that the web was going to do the same thing on mobile. It's going to be the same basic thing, just on a smaller device that had battery, more of a limited CPU, and that kind of thing. In fact, the first iPhone, the way to build apps for it was actually web apps. But that didn't last for too long. And as everybody knows now, mobile is all about apps, right? It's all about having an app for that for everything. Now, I'm biased. Obviously, I work on browsers and have for 8 or so years now. But I think that's not the entire picture. I think there's a lot more that's going on in this space. So forgive the abstract diagram here, but this is a way I think about this problem. So on the y-axis, you have value. This is more of like the abstract value that users get from interacting with businesses that they want to interact with and buy things from, and that businesses get from users who interact with them. And on the x-axis, you've got users, organized by how engaged they want to be with your business. So at the very far left is people who clicked the link to your site accidentally, said, oops, bounced, and never came back. And on the very far right is the president of your fan club. And ideally, you want people to move up this curve over time. As they interact with your business, they want to become more and more engaged to a higher level. And it's also a relatively smooth curve. But if you look at this with native apps, I think this is the area that it actually covers. Your most engaged users are the ones who come back, they engage a whole lot in these really rich native app experiences. But of course, this is only one portion of the larger space. There's all this other gray area, users who want to engage with you but aren't able to in that space. Because with apps, you have this do or die moment. Is the user going to install my app, or are they not? And there's a lot of people that don't necessarily want to install your app. It's a big commitment. It takes up space on your phone, it takes up a slot on your home screen, and it turns out there are lots of users who just don't want to do it. So if you don't have a use case where users want to come to your site weekly or daily, they might just not want to come to your site. So we've seen a bunch of funnels like this. We talk about this a lot in the sort of technology space. We know that some people will come to our apps and that they're going to drop out at some point in the funnel. So they'll come to our site, they'll tap a banner over to go to the Play Store or the App Store. They'll decide to install it. They'll wait for it to install. At every point, you're losing people in this funnel. And if you look, it's very context dependent. But if you look at different stages in this funnel, you generally see that the percent that actually make it through that stage is low single digits and maybe at the highest 20%. So for example, Google Plus did release a case study a few years ago and showed that if users came to the site, they saw a full screen interstitial that said, hey, go get the app. And only 9% of users clicked through that. And that's actually pretty high in the industry. And the other thing that's actually very misleading about this sort of classic chart is these steps compound. If you fall out of the first stage of the funnel, you don't make it to the second stage. So those low numbers actually multiply like crazy. So this actually is much more realistic in terms of what the number of users who are getting through your funnel. So if you look at this original graph, it's actually more like this in terms of the value that you're creating. Which isn't that big in the grand scheme of things, obviously. And if you're Facebook, maybe this part of the graph is pretty big. But if you aren't Facebook, it's probably somewhat small. And also, for many businesses, if users don't interact with you all that often, you might not have any space that people really want to install that app in general. So if you sell couches, that's your primary thing, people don't buy a couch every week. And so that's not necessarily that they're going to want to come back to that experience. There's tons of missing value here. But luckily, the web never went away on mobile. And so it's possible to build experiences that reach many users with that low friction, but historically they haven't been great, right? Users come to them, they don't engage all that much. And part of the reason is because I think a lot of businesses take their desktop web app and they just shrink it down to the mobile space. And they say, yeah, we got a web app. People come to it. They don't really use it that much, I guess, on mobile. That's just how it works, I guess. And they kind of give up. But this picture does not feel right to me. There's so much value that's being left on the table for users and for businesses. It can't just be that you have a small number of highly engaged users and a whole bunch of people in kind of this wasteland. So when I think about what makes apps special, I think one thing that's really important that people don't think too much about is that when you invest in an app, you don't just shrink down your desktop experience. You really have to think from the ground up, what does the user actually want to do in this context, in this moment? Because on desktop, it's way more goal-directed. I want to buy a couch. I'm going to go research, open up a bunch of tabs, figure out what I want to do, then maybe search for prices, and then ultimately purchase. But on mobile, it's very different. People are generally on their devices in sort of this found time that I don't know what people did decades ago, to be quite honest, because it seems like it would be really boring. But even in the home, you have people who are watching TV and looking at their mobile devices. At Starbucks, you place an order for a coffee. You got maybe 3 minutes or so. You pull out your phone. You're like, Pinterest. Or in the taxi, when you're just trying to kill time and focus on, try not to focus on how scary it is driving through city traffic sometimes. So in these contexts, if you're trying to sell couches, the way to do it is not to try to get the conversion right there at that moment when someone's just waiting for their coffee. That's probably not going to happen. It's more about helping people be inspired by the types of things they want to buy. So be able to immerse and say, oh, that's really interesting. I hadn't really thought about that particular style or how these different types of furniture could go along together. And I think that this is really important. It's the critical thing, is the reason about your user in the context and in the moment that they're actually reaching you in the way they want to engage with you. And luckily, this is not app specific. You can do this on your sites, mobile websites as well. So I think a number of folks, as they've invested in this, they've seen that just by being really thoughtful about the way that they approach this value, they can have a much more immersive, much more engaging experience. It doesn't have to be this wasteland. But there's still this missing value. There's still this gray portion that web just can't do. And so a few years ago, a number of browser vendors and us, we got together and we tried to solve this problem and figure out what that missing piece was. And there's three major pieces. The first is connectivity. So on desktop, you always had a connection. You didn't have to worry about the data dropping. But on mobile, you are constantly on the go in different conditions. So people are like, oh no, I have LTE. All my customers are premium customers, they got LTE. But that doesn't mean that much because radio waves are influenced by metal and buildings and all kinds of stuff. So as you're walking down the street, you're coming in and out of connectivity. And if you're in an app, you generally have all the resources locally, so that when you tap, it just kind of loads a little bit more slowly. But on web, when you tap and don't have connectivity, you see an error page, effectively. You see this offline dinosaur. You feel like you fell off the edge of the internet. And that's not a great experience. The next one is push notifications. Push notifications, when they came out, were kind of this interesting novelty that was great for chat applications. But it turns out that having timely information on the go that you can react to is perfect for people in those contexts. And so push notifications really are just a part of the fabric of what users expect in a mobile experience. And the last one seems kind of silly, but people really don't like typing on mobile. It's just more of a pain. So if I'm sitting there at Starbucks and I've got 3 minutes, even if I would really love to go to Washington Post right now, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to open up my phone and go, Pinterest. Even though, had Washington Post been there as an option to fall back into, I might have chosen that, which would have been great for Washington Post and great for me. So we talked about a lot of these. In this space, standards take a long time. So it's been, I think, 4 or 5 years that we've been working with Mozilla and Microsoft and Samsung and Opera and many others. And the good news is that we've actually brought solutions in terms of new web standards for all of these. So I'm not going to go into the details about what exactly these are, words like service workers or add to home screen or web push notifications. The point is, though, that these are optional. So you can build the best experience you want for your users in the context they are. And if they come to you in a browser that supports these new web standards, you can just make that experience much better. So that's, of course, surprise, the missing piece, that missing value that historically has not been possible to get. One thing that's really important about this is you notice there's a few jumps that are kind of discontinuities. And that represents the notion of, say someone's buying that couch. They've decided after a long time they've been inspired on multiple, in desktop, in person, maybe they've seen it in your retail store, and they're like, I want to purchase right now, and it's out of stock. So they don't want to install your app, it's way too much commitment. But if it says, hey, do you want to get notified when this couch comes back in stock? Sure, that sounds right. So that's an opportunity to create more engagement with that user in a way that's good for everybody. So these are jumps that are very difficult to get if you have to convince them to go all the way to app. So you can have a much smoother gradation and build that relationship with users over time. So I think this is a bit of a paradigm shift in terms of what we can do now. On desktop, historically, about a decade ago, there was another paradigm shift. This is the word that Luke said wouldn't necessarily know, but we called it AJAX. It was this notion of building the best possible web experience you could. Just that users would understand and expect a much more rich experience. And I think the same thing is happening on mobile. And we call it progressive web apps. So it's really about redefining what modern mobile web development means. It means holding yourself to a much higher standard, thinking through very carefully the user experience, what users want to actually engage with you in the context, in the moment, in the place that they come to interact with you. And then, of course, in places that have these new web standards like Chrome, Firefox, soon Edge, and other browsers, giving them an even better experience in that. So we've seen across the world in the past year or so, basically in every vertical, we have a great example of a progressive web app. In every market around the world, we've seen examples of these. In some markets, like India, basically every vertical has one of their major players has built a progressive web app. In the United States, folks like Forbes, Washington Post, Lyft, and most recently Twitter have shipped progressive web apps, and many more of them are on the way. And just a couple weeks ago, Gartner released a report talking about how important they were. And when you look at how these actually impact users, across the board, in every one that we've looked at, the numbers are pretty big. So this is Alibaba, which is an e-commerce player. And this is just one of the examples. We've got about 13 or 14 case studies published. And we see lots of companies are publishing their own case studies. They're just so excited by the numbers that they're seeing. And we're seeing, again, this huge engagement, this lift in conversions, in engagement, in time spent, just capturing more of that value for users. And it makes sense, right? Just by focusing on building the best experience you can, there's a lot more that you can do as opposed to just shrinking your desktop site down. So the reason I'm up here with Luke is because West Elm is a great example of a retailer who's on the forefront of thinking through this. And so they've recently are rethinking how their mobile experience works, and are building an awesome progressive web app. So he's going to tell you more about it.